In the late 1930s, at the height of global uncertainty, an American heiress stood inside the Kremlin, surrounded by Soviet officials, crystal chandeliers glowing above her head as Joseph Stalin observed from across the room. This was not a spy, not a diplomat by training, and not a revolutionary. She was one of the wealthiest women in the United States, born into industrial fortune during America's Gilded Age, and her presence in Moscow was both extraordinary and unsettling. At a time when capitalism and communism were hardening into enemies, she moved between worlds that were never meant to touch. She was born at the end of the 19th century, when American wealth was consolidating into dynasties. Railroads, food empires, steel, banking. This was an era where a single family could quietly influence markets, politics, and public opinion. Her inheritance placed her inside that elite circle. But unlike many heirs who remained invisible, she lived publicly, lavishly, and deliberately. By the 1930s, her fortune was not just personal wealth, it was tied to food supply chains, media ownership, real estate, and political access. Money, in her hands, became infrastructure. The United States was still recovering from the Great Depression when her life took an unexpected geopolitical turn. Washington needed a trusted figure in Moscow, someone who could host, charm, observe, and report. The Soviet Union under Stalin was closed, suspicious, and hostile to outsiders. Formal diplomacy alone was failing. What worked better were dinners, receptions, social rituals, and the subtle intelligence that came from proximity. And so this American heiress arrived in the Soviet capital not merely as a guest, but as a social instrument of statecraft. Her residence quickly became one of the most unusual American outposts in Moscow. While shortages plagued the Soviet population, her table was carefully set, ingredients imported, standards maintained. These were not indulgences for vanity, they were calculated displays. Soviet officials who attended her gatherings later recalled the contrast, the austerity of the streets outside versus the elegance within. Food, conversation, and etiquette became tools. Every dinner was a performance, every guest list deliberate. It was during this period that she attended official Kremlin functions where Stalin was present. These were not casual meals. They were rigidly staged, closely monitored events where every movement carried risk. Stalin rarely trusted anyone, least of all an American capitalist heiress, yet she was allowed into the room. She observed him directly, his silences, his habits, the way others reacted to his presence. Her notes and letters from this period would later become valuable historical records, not because they revealed secrets, but because they captured atmosphere, fear, power, and control. Back in the United States, her wealth continued to operate almost independently of her physical location. She held controlling interests in major companies that affected food production and distribution across the country. During economic instability, that kind of control mattered. Decisions made in boardrooms connected to her fortune influenced prices, employment, and supply. While she did not hold public office, her financial reach intersected constantly with policy. Presidents listened, advisors returned her calls. What made her unusual was not simply that she was rich, but that she understood influence as something broader than money. She cultivated relationships across ideological lines. In America, she moved comfortably among politicians, military leaders, and cultural elites. In the Soviet Union, she adapted without surrendering her identity. She never became sympathetic to communism, but she learned how to exist within its rituals. That ability, to enter hostile systems without being consumed by them, was rare. As Europe edged closer to war, the information she gathered socially became strategically useful. Who attended which dinners, who avoided eye contact, who drank too much, who spoke freely and who did not. None of it was classified intelligence in the traditional sense, but it shaped understanding. When official diplomatic channels stalled, these impressions filled gaps. At the same time, American newspapers continued to cover her lifestyle, her art collections, her estates, her philanthropy, often unaware of how closely her life now brushed against global power. To the public, she was a symbol of old money elegance. Behind the scenes, she was a node in a network connecting American wealth, Soviet opacity, and looming war. By the end of the decade, her time in Moscow would come to an end, but the consequences of that chapter would linger. She had seen Stalin not as a caricature, but as a man operating within a system he dominated through fear and calculation. She returned to the United States with a sharper understanding of how power behaved when unchecked, and how wealth, when organized, could rival governments in influence. This was only the beginning. The girl born into Gilded Age luxury had crossed into the most dangerous political environment of the 20th century and emerged intact. The question that followed her home was unsettling. How much power had she actually held all along? When she returned to the United States after her years in Moscow, she did not arrive as a socialite returning from an exotic posting. She came back altered, more precise, more guarded, and far more aware of how fragile systems really were. America, in the late 1930s, was recovering, but the scars of the Great Depression were still visible. Banks had failed, farms had collapsed, and trust in institutions remained thin. In that environment, concentrated wealth was not merely comfort, it was leverage. Her fortune was deeply embedded in food production, processing, and distribution, an area most Americans never thought about unless it failed. Grain prices, supply contracts, transportation logistics, storage facilities, these were not abstract numbers, they were the arteries of daily survival. Through inherited control and strategic consolidation, she now sat at the intersection of all of them. When prices stabilized, her companies benefited. When shortages threatened, her decisions mattered. Unlike robber barons of an earlier era, she did not operate loudly. She avoided public confrontations and preferred indirect pressure. Regulatory agencies noticed that certain policies stalled when they touched industries connected to her holdings. Politicians noticed that campaigns remained solvent when they remained cordial. Journalists noticed doors closing quietly. Nothing illegal was provable. Nothing overt was necessary. Her experience in Stalin's Soviet Union had taught her a lesson America rarely acknowledged. Systems appear permanent until they are not. In Moscow, she had seen how quickly food, fear, and power could be centralized. Back home, she understood that democratic systems were slower but not immune. Control did not require dictatorship, it required coordination. As war broke out in Europe, American neutrality created unusual economic conditions. Demand fluctuated, exports surged, and domestic supply chains tightened. Her companies expanded quietly during this chaos, acquiring smaller competitors under the banner of efficiency. By the early 1940s, the reach of her financial empire was broader than ever, but still largely invisible to the public. This invisibility was intentional. She avoided headlines, preferring philanthropy as a shield. Universities, cultural institutions, museums, her name appeared where prestige softened scrutiny. Meanwhile, her private correspondence revealed a sharper awareness of geopolitical risk. She was not merely protecting wealth, she was positioning it. By the time the United States entered World War II, her resources were already aligned with national needs. Government contracts flowed toward firms that could deliver reliably and fast. Hers could. Officials trusted her logistics because they had little choice. Reliability became power. And power, once normalized, rarely retreats. During the war years, her influence reached a level that even insiders struggled to map. She did not control America's wealth alone, but she controlled enough of its circulation to matter. Food was only one dimension. Media ownership, indirect stakes in advertising, and quiet relationships with major publishers meant narratives could be softened or sharpened when needed. This was not crude propaganda, it was omission. Certain stories simply never gained traction, investigations stalled, editors hesitated. No one received explicit orders, the system adjusted itself around her presence. What made her particularly effective was discipline. She rarely appeared in person where power was exercised. Decisions traveled through lawyers, trustees, executives, and intermediaries.
Her fingerprints were difficult to isolate. Even congressional inquiries into post-war economic concentration struggled to articulate her role clearly. Behind closed doors, however, she was direct. Executives later recalled meetings where she spoke less about profit and more about stability. Markets, she believed, should not panic. Panic created political backlash. Stability preserved influence. This philosophy shaped how her companies behaved: slow, methodical, unflashy. Her earlier proximity to Stalin had reinforced this worldview. She had seen how fear accelerated collapse. America, she believed, needed the opposite illusion: choice without disruption. By the late 1940s, as the Cold War hardened, her Soviet experience gained new relevance. Intelligence agencies consulted her informally, not for secrets, but for judgment. She understood authoritarian psychology better than most Americans in power. She knew when compromise was futile and when patience worked. Publicly, she remained a benefactor of culture and education. Privately, she had become something closer to an unofficial strategist, someone who did not make policy, but shaped the environment policy operated within. She was never elected, she never ran, yet her wealth allowed her to outlast administrations, ideologies, and scandals. Presidents passed, markets fluctuated, her structure endured.
Power, even quiet power, extracts a price. By the 1950s, scrutiny intensified. Journalists began questioning concentration of wealth. Antitrust rhetoric returned. Younger politicians viewed old money dynasties with suspicion. She responded the way she always had, by stepping further back. Control shifted more fully into trusts. Boards became buffers. Her public appearances grew rarer. This retreat was not weakness, it was insulation. She had learned from history that visibility invited disruption. Yet isolation followed. Those close to her described a woman increasingly cautious, aware that influence without legitimacy could become dangerous. She had dined with Stalin and seen how absolute power ends, alone, paranoid, and feared. She had no intention of repeating that arc. Her philanthropy expanded dramatically during this period, not merely as image management, but as legacy engineering. Institutions bearing her name would outlive markets. Endowments would stabilize influence beyond her lifetime. At the same time, the industries she once controlled began fragmenting under regulation and technological change. Television disrupted print. Industrial agriculture transformed supply chains. Control became harder to maintain without centralization, and centralization now attracted resistance. She adapted again. Rather than dominate, she diversified. Influence dispersed across sectors rather than concentrated in one. It was less visible, harder to trace, and safer. The public never fully understood the scale of what she had once controlled, or why it slowly receded. History prefers villains or heroes. She fit neither category neatly.
When she died, headlines were respectful but restrained. An heiress, a philanthropist, a patron of culture. Few mentioned Moscow. Fewer still mentioned Stalin. The dinners that once bridged capitalism and communism faded into footnotes. Yet her life raises uncomfortable questions. How much power can exist outside formal authority? How easily can wealth shape systems without appearing to rule them? And how often does history overlook the quiet architects in favor of loud actors? She never sought domination in the way dictators do. She preferred alignment. Her genius, if it can be called that, was understanding that control works best when people believe they are choosing freely. She dined with Stalin and learned what fear does to nations. She returned to America and ensured fear never needed to be used. That difference defined her legacy. America's wealth was never hers alone, but for a crucial period, it moved according to structures she helped design. That influence did not announce itself, it simply worked. And perhaps that is why her story matters now. because the most powerful forces are rarely the most visible.